My name is Linda McAllister. I'm 67 years old, and last night a young man told me I was too poor to be part of his family. This morning, that same man woke up in a mansion that no longer belongs to him. People think revenge is about anger, but sometimes it's about silence. The kind of silence that makes others destroy themselves without you saying a single word. When Ethan, my daughter's fiancé, looked at me across that long dinner table and said, "Sarah deserves to marry up," I felt my stomach turn to stone. His mother, Veronica, nodded approvingly, a glass of white wine glinting between her diamond fingers. "You seem like a decent woman, Linda," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But our family has certain standards. The wedding should reflect that." Her words sounded like a verdict, not a suggestion. I smiled politely, but something inside me began to die, or maybe it began to wake up. They thought they were talking to a harmless old widow who lived off her late husband's pension. They didn't know that for the past 30 years I'd been the silent partner behind several investment firms, that I'd learned how to multiply money while they were still learning how to spend it. My late husband used to say, "Real wealth is the kind that doesn't need to show off." I had built a life around that principle. My house was modest, my clothes plain, my car an old Volvo that creaked in the cold. But every time I heard its engine cough, I smiled, because it reminded me of the years when dignity mattered more than status. At that dinner, though, dignity was invisible. What they saw was my cheap dress, my wrinkled hands, my thrift store purse. They didn't see the woman who had survived cancer, built a portfolio from scratch, and put her daughter through law school without a single loan. Veronica kept asking questions that weren't questions. "So what do you do all day? Linda, must be nice to have free time. You live alone, right? That must get lonely. Do you ever travel?" "Oh, of course not. Travel is expensive." Each word was a cut delivered with a smile. Sarah sat there frozen between embarrassment and disbelief, clutching Ethan's hand like it was the last piece of stability she had left. I didn't react. I let them talk. Sometimes the best way to expose arrogance is to let it echo. When the waiter brought dessert, Ethan made his final comment. "You know, Mrs. McAllister, my mother and I were thinking maybe this ceremony should be hosted at our estate in Newport. It's more appropriate for our family's different backgrounds." Our family's different backgrounds. That was the polite version of "you don't belong with us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she couldn't show. I remember staring at the candle between us, the wax slowly melting, thinking how similar it was to pride, soft at first, then gone before you realize it. When we got home that night, Sarah tried to defend him. "He didn't mean it, Mom. He's just under pressure." I nodded but said nothing. I'd learned long ago that when someone shows you who they are, you don't correct them. You take notes. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and looked up the Whitmore estate in Newport. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just wanted to see what kind of palace made a man believe he was better than the woman who raised his fiancé. The listing appeared on a real estate site, a sprawling white mansion overlooking the ocean, valued at $7 million. But what caught my eye wasn't the photos. It was the small red note at the bottom of the page, "Bank auction pending." I leaned closer, reread it, and felt my pulse quicken. The mighty Whitmores were drowning in debt. Veronica's diamond bracelets, Ethan's tailored suits, their lavish parties, all financed by credit they couldn't sustain. My fingers trembled, not from anger, but from clarity. Life has a strange way of handing you the weapon you need at the exact moment you're done being silent. I whispered to myself, "So they think I'm poor." Then I laughed quietly at first, then louder until it echoed through the kitchen. The kind of laugh that comes when you realize the story isn't over. It's just changing authors. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. I fed my cat, watered the garden, and baked a small loaf of bread. But inside, my head plans were forming with the precision of a chess match. Every move needed to be quiet, deliberate, final. People like the Whitmores thrive on perception. They build empires of glass and pray no one throws a stone. I intended to throw one so gently they wouldn't hear it until the cracks appeared. That evening, Sarah came home looking pale. "Mom, they want you to sign something." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a polite letter from Veronica's lawyer suggesting that I limit my involvement in the wedding decisions due to financial disparities. It was wrapped in legal jargon but smelled of contempt. I folded the paper carefully, set it on the counter, and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. Don't worry about a thing." I could see relief and confusion battling in her eyes. "You're not angry?" she asked. "No," I said, "I'm just thinking." That night, I drove to my husband's old office, which I had quietly kept under my name all these years. The same office where we had built our first investment fund. The security guard, an old friend, smiled when he saw me. "Evening, Mrs. McAllister." Burning the midnight oil again, I smiled back. Something like that. Inside, the air smelled like paper and memory. I turned on the desk lamp, opened the laptop, and logged into my brokerage account. The balance blinked at me, $12.3 million. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I wasn't thinking of revenge. I was thinking of legacy. I looked at the photo of Sarah on my desk. Her graduation cap tilted her smile bright. "You married up the moment you were born," I whispered. Then I clicked open a new tab and searched Whitmore Estate Bank auction. The date read Friday 9 a.m. open to verified bidders only, 3 days away. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the weight of destiny settle in. Sometimes life gives you insults. Sometimes it gives you opportunities disguised as insults. The Whitmores had just given me both. Tell me something if someone insulted your family. Would you stay quiet, or would you make sure they woke up one morning realizing everything they owned belonged to you? Comment 1 if you do what I did. Like this story if you believe dignity is worth more than diamonds. 3 days before the auction, Sarah called me early in the morning. Her voice was shaky, the kind of tone she used when she was pretending everything was fine. "Mom, Ethan's parents want to invite us for dinner. They said it's time to discuss the wedding budget." She hesitated. "They also asked if you could wear something formal." I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "Formal, I can do formal." What they meant was expensive. But the beauty of experience is that you learn how to weaponize simplicity. That night, I wore a dark navy dress that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't new, but it was elegant in a quiet way, linen that had survived decades like me. When I arrived at the Whitmore estate, the gate opened automatically, revealing a long driveway lined with manicured hedges and white lanterns. The house loomed ahead like a cathedral built to worship wealth. Inside, everything gleamed: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, paintings of ancestors who had probably never lifted a finger in their lives. Veronica met me at the door, her smile polished and hollow. "Linda, so lovely you could join us." Her voice dripped with the same syrupy tone used for customer service. "I hope the drive wasn't too long." She glanced at my car parked outside an old Volvo with chipped paint. Her eyes flickered with amusement, still driving that classic "how charming." Ethan appeared behind her, his arm around Sarah. He looked every bit the perfect gentleman, but his eyes had that same glint of superiority his mother carried. "Come in, Mrs. McAllister. Dinner's ready. We've been looking forward to this conversation." The dining room looked like a museum exhibit, porcelain plates that had probably never touched actual food, gold-trimmed glasses, and a centerpiece of white roses that smelled faintly artificial. Veronica motioned for me to sit at the end of the table. It wasn't subtle. The patriarch's seat was reserved for her late husband's portrait above the fireplace, as though the room needed a ghost to remind everyone who once ruled. As we ate, the small talk was painfully polite. Sarah tried to keep the conversation alive, talking about wedding colors and flower arrangements, but Veronica steered it back to what she really wanted to discuss: money. "So, Linda," she began, her fork tapping lightly against the porcelain, "Ethan and Sarah are planning quite the celebration. You know, the kind of wedding that sets a family apart." I nodded, cutting into my chicken slowly. "Of course. Every mother wants her daughter's day to be special." "Exactly," Veronica said, leaning forward. "We've already booked the caterers and the orchestra. The estate can host up to 300 guests, though we might keep it exclusive, only our close circles. Now we'll need to coordinate expenses. The total comes to roughly $280,000. Naturally, our family will cover the majority, but perhaps you could contribute a symbolic portion. Say $50,000. She said it like she was offering me a charity opportunity. The room went silent. Sarah's hand tightened around her napkin. Ethan kept his eyes on his plate. I felt every second stretch into an eternity. 50,000, I repeated calmly. Symbolic indeed. Of course, Veronica added quickly, we understand that might be a challenge for you. It's just tradition for both families to participate. Appearances, you know. Appearances. That was the word that defined their lives. I smiled the kind of smile that makes people wonder what you're hiding. Tradition is important, I said softly, and so is respect. Veronica blinked momentarily, thrown off by my tone. Oh, absolutely, she said, forcing another smile. Mutual respect is what makes families work. Ethan cleared his throat. Mom just means we want the wedding to reflect both sides equally. I turned to him, my voice steady. And what does equality look like to you, Ethan? He hesitated. Well, my family has certain expectations. Expectations, I interrupted gently, or conditions. The air shifted. Veronica's smile froze. Sarah stared at me, wide-eyed, silently pleading for peace. I set my fork down, folded my hands, and looked at them the way I used to look at clients who thought they could outsmart a contract. When my husband and I got married, I said quietly, we had nothing but 2 rings and a second-hand suit. We built everything ourselves, but we never once demanded proof of worth from the people we loved. So forgive me if I don't understand what kind of love needs a price tag. For the first time all evening, Veronica lost her composure. Well, she said sharply, some of us have reputations to maintain. And some of us, I replied, have integrity to protect. A faint flush crept up her neck. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should all calm down, he said, pretending to laugh. We're just trying to make this wedding perfect. I looked at Sarah, who was blinking back tears. Perfection is overrated, sweetheart, I said gently. Marry for peace, not perfection. After dinner, as I was leaving, I overheard Veronica whisper to her son near the doorway. She's not suitable company, Ethan. Keep your fiancé's mother out of our affairs. The less she's seen, the better. I didn't turn around. I just smiled to myself as I stepped into the cold night air. Words like that used to hurt me. Now they just confirmed that my instincts were right. People who build castles out of arrogance eventually live in ruins. When I got home, the house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where my husband and I had spent years planning investments no one knew about. I opened my laptop and reviewed the financial report from the bank. The Whitmore estate debt had increased by another 5%. Their loan interest was crushing them. I checked the list of verified bidders for the auction. My application had already been approved. I took a deep breath, staring at the screen. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. For a brief second, I thought of Sarah, her innocence, her kindness, the way she always believed love could fix anything. I realized she would never learn the truth unless she saw it unfold. And maybe that was the lesson she needed. Not all wolves wear fur. Some wear tuxedos and call you family. I closed the laptop, whispering into the dark, let them underestimate me one more day. Then I looked at the clock past midnight and smiled. 3 days left until the auction. 3 days until the masks came off. People often ask what revenge feels like. The truth is, it doesn't feel like fire. It feels like patience. Cold, deliberate, silent patience. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. Tell me something, would you have stayed quiet at that table, or would you have let them see the storm in your eyes? Comment 1. If you would have done exactly what I did. Like this, if you've ever been judged for what you drive, not who you are. The next morning, sunlight poured into the kitchen like nothing had happened, but my mind was still replaying every word from that dinner. Arrogance has a peculiar aftertaste. It lingers bitter and metallic long after the conversation ends. I poured myself coffee and opened the morning paper. On the society page, a small photo caught my eye. Whitmore Family Hosts Charity Gala. There they were, Ethan and Veronica, smiling under the headline, their arms wrapped around donors and politicians, pretending generosity wasn't just another performance. The caption mentioned that the event was sponsored in part by the Newport Heritage Bank. I knew that bank. I'd helped restructure it 20 years ago before I retired, and I knew its chairman, Peter Lang, a man who still owed me a favor. Before I could think further, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "Mom," she said quietly, "can you come over? It's important." Her voice was tight, hesitant, like someone standing on the edge of a confession. When I arrived at their townhouse, Sarah was pacing the living room, clutching a folder. Ethan sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, looking like this was just another inconvenient errand. "What's wrong?" I asked. Sarah turned to me, her eyes red. "They want me to sign a prenuptial agreement." I looked at Ethan. He didn't even glance up. "It's standard," he said flatly. "My parents' lawyer prepared it. It just outlines what happens if you know things go wrong." "If things go wrong," I repeated. How comforting. He finally looked at me, trying for charm, but landing somewhere between arrogance and boredom. "It's just legal protection, Mrs. McAllister. You understand finances, you must know how these things work." "I do," I said, my voice steady, "but I also understand intent. Tell me, Ethan, does your version of marriage start with trust or with paperwork?" He smirked slightly, "With reality." Sarah's lips trembled. "He says it's just formality, but Mom, it says that if we divorce, I don't get anything, not even the house." "The house?" I asked. Ethan shrugged. "It's family property." "No," I said slowly, "it's mortgaged property." His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." I smiled faintly. "Nothing, just an observation." Sarah sat down, burying her face in her hands. "I don't want to fight about money. I just wanted to marry the man I love." "Then make sure he loves you back." "Not your compliance," I said softly. "There's a difference." Ethan got up, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Mrs. McAllister, with all due respect, you don't understand how families like ours operate." "You're right," I said. "I don't understand people who confuse pride with value." He left the room without another word. Sarah looked at me helplessly. "Mom, what should I do?" "Sign it," I said calmly. Her eyes widened. "What?" "Sign it," I repeated, "and smile while you do. Let them think they've won." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the woman in front of her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't either. But sometimes, to protect your child, you have to play along with the enemy's game long enough to flip the board. After I left, I drove to the Whitmore estate again, though this time not through the front gate. I parked down the road and walked along the beach path that ran behind their property. The tide was low, the sea calm and gray, like it was waiting for something to break. Through the hedge, I could see the back terrace. A young woman was arranging flower vases, humming softly to herself. She looked up when I stepped closer. "You must be new," I said. "Yes, ma'am," she replied in a light Spanish accent. "I started 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Whitmore likes everything perfect for the wedding." Her name was Rosa. We talked briefly, and when I mentioned that I used to work in finance, she lowered her voice. "Then maybe you can tell me something, ma'am. The bank people came again yesterday. They spoke to Mr. Ethan in the study. Mrs. Whitmore looked upset. She told me to pretend I didn't hear." I smiled kindly. "You did nothing wrong, Rosa." But inside, my heart was pounding. The timing made sense. Their debt had matured. The bank must have issued a final notice. If they failed to pay, the estate would go to auction within days. And they were still planning a 6-figure wedding. Pride is the most expensive addiction there is. "Thank you, dear," I told her. "You've helped more than you know." That evening, I called Peter Lang, the chairman of Newport Heritage Bank. He answered on the second ring. "Linda McAllister." He said, his tone warm but cautious. "I haven't heard that name in a while." "I only call when it matters," I said. "I need information about an upcoming auction, the Whitmore estate." He exhaled softly. "Ah, yes, that's a messy one. They're in deep. The mortgage is underwater, but confidentiality." "Spare me the speech," I interrupted gently. "You owe me, Peter. I kept your firm alive during the 2008 collapse." Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Fair enough. The auction's scheduled for Friday morning, 10 a.m. Minimum bid, $4.8 million. They think they can refinance, but that approval isn't coming. You're planning to buy it, aren't you?" "Planning," I said, and preparing. When I hung up, I looked at the framed photo of my husband on the desk. "We used to save people from bankruptcy," I whispered. "Now I'm about to buy someone else's arrogance." The next day, I went to see my lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, a tall man with silver hair and a talent for discretion. He reviewed the auction documents quietly, then looked up at me. "You understand what you're doing." "Linda, this isn't just a purchase, it's a message." "Exactly," I said. "And messages are only effective when they're loud enough to echo." He nodded slowly. In that case, I'll prepare the paperwork under McAllister Holdings. No one will connect it to you until the deed is finalized. Perfect, I said. And Jonathan, make sure the transfer is processed immediately after the auction closes. I want the new ownership recorded before they wake up. He smiled slightly. You've always been the quiet storm type? Quiet, I said, but not harmless. That night, Sarah called again. Her voice was fragile. Mom, Ethan's family is making me feel like I'm marrying into royalty. They talk about legacy and bloodlines like they're ancient nobility. I don't even know who I am around them anymore. You're my daughter, I said. That's enough. She sniffled. I signed the prenup. I know, I replied. You did the right thing. Why do you sound so calm? Because calm is how you win. When we hung up, I sat in the dark listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It reminded me of my husband's voice, saying, "Don't fight noise with noise, Linda." People reveal themselves in silence. By Thursday, the Whitmores' desperation was becoming visible. Gossip spreads fast in wealthy towns. My friend Helen from the Rotary Club called to tell me she'd overheard Veronica arguing with a banker at the club's lounge. She's panicking, Helen said. Something about an appraisal gone wrong. I think she's about to lose everything. Let her, I said simply. That evening, I drove by the estate again. Through the large windows, I could see them hosting another dinner, pretending everything was normal. Laughter echoed from inside, but it sounded brittle, forced. I parked across the street, watching the light flicker from their chandelier. It was strange, almost poetic, seeing a house so full of pride sitting on a foundation of debt. Inside my car, I whispered to myself, 24 hours. The next morning, I arrived at the auction house early. The room smelled of polished wood and cold ambition. Bidders murmured quietly, their faces half hidden behind sleek suits and numbers. I took a seat in the back, unnoticed, wearing a gray scarf that made me look like any other retiree. The auctioneer began his introductions, voice booming, lot number 72, the Whitmore Estate, Newport. Opening bid, $4.8 million. The first bidder raised his paddle. $5 million, another followed. 5.2. My pulse was steady. I waited, letting them exhaust themselves. At 5.8, the room thinned. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. Any further bids? I raised my paddle. $6 million. Heads turned. The room went silent. The auctioneer smiled. $6 million from bidder 49. Going once, going twice. No one else moved. Sold. The gavel struck the podium sharp as thunder. I exhaled slowly. My phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan, transfer initiated. Title recording at 10:42 a.m. Congratulations, Linda. You now own the Whitmore estate. I looked out the window at the gray morning sky, feeling nothing like victory, only clarity. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers, then signs the deed. Tell me, if someone tried to buy your dignity with their arrogance, would you sell it? Or would you buy their house instead? Comment 1. If you do exactly what I did. Like this, if you believe silence can be the loudest revenge. The morning after the auction felt eerily ordinary. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes the ocean look like metal, and the wind carried a faint chill. I made myself tea, sliced a piece of toast, and pretended the world hadn't shifted overnight. But it had. Somewhere across town, the Whitmores were waking up in a house that no longer belonged to them. I imagined Veronica stepping out onto her marble balcony, sipping her imported coffee, blissfully unaware that the walls around her now whispered someone else's name. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. Triumph comes after the storm, not before. What I felt was calm, an eerie, deliberate calm that only comes when every move has gone exactly as planned. At 9:30 sharp, Jonathan called. The deed's been processed. The title has your signature. Congratulations, Mrs. McAllister. You're now the official owner of the Whitmore estate. Thank you, Jonathan, I said, my voice steady. Now let's make sure no one knows. Not yet. He chuckled. You really are enjoying this, aren't you? I'm not, I said softly. I'm just teaching a lesson they'll never forget. That same afternoon, Sarah came over. Her face looked pale, her smile forced. Mom, can we talk? She asked as soon as she stepped inside. Of course, I said, pouring her tea. She hesitated before speaking. Ethan's family is hosting a pre-wedding dinner this weekend. They said it's important, something about introducing our family properly to society. She looked down at her hands. They didn't exactly invite you, Mom. They said it's... A young crowd. I smiled though my chest tightened. A young crowd, I repeated. How convenient. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I tried to insist, but they said the venue was limited and— Sarah, I interrupted gently. You don't need to apologize for their manners. She looked up, eyes glistening. Mom, am I making a mistake? I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to shake her shoulders and scream, run. But I saw the confusion in her face, the part of her that still believed love could fix cruelty. I couldn't take that belief from her. Not yet. Sometimes I said people have to lose everything to realize what really matters. She frowned. What do you mean? Nothing, darling. Just remember, money doesn't make people better. It just makes their flaws more visible. When she left, I sat by the window, watching her car disappear down the street. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. My husband used to say that motherhood is a lifelong war between protection and restraint. You want to shield your children from pain, but some lessons are earned only through heartbreak. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a familiar, sharp voice greeted me. Linda, this is Veronica. Good evening, I said pleasantly. To what do I owe the pleasure? She ignored my tone. I'll get straight to the point. I'm concerned about your influence on Sarah. She's been emotional lately, questioning things. I think it's best if you give her some space before the wedding. Transitions can be delicate, you understand? My fingers tightened around the phone. You're asking a mother to distance herself from her daughter before her own wedding. I'm asking you to consider what's best for Sarah, she said smoothly. She needs stability, not confusion. We both know your modest background can be difficult for her to reconcile with our world. I'm trying to make this transition easier. Easier, I repeated, by erasing me. Don't be dramatic, Linda. She sighed. You should be grateful. Ethan's marrying your daughter into a better life. You wouldn't want to make things uncomfortable. Grateful. The words struck like acid. I think you and I have very different definitions of comfort, Veronica. I'm sure we do, she said curtly. Good evening. She hung up before I could answer. For a long moment, I stood in the dark kitchen, the dial tone humming in my ear. Then I laughed quietly. Not the kind of laugh that comes from humor, but the kind that slips out when something inside you finally snaps into place. I looked at the folder on the counter, the deed to the Whitmore estate, and whispered, You have no idea what's coming. 2 days later, Sarah texted me from the Whitmore estate dinner tonight. Big announcement, wish you were here. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Rosa the housemaid. They're having a party tonight, I said. Yes, ma'am, she whispered. Lots of people coming. Fancy cars, photographers. They said it's an engagement celebration. Mrs. Whitmore is very nervous. The banker called again this morning. What did she say? She said to stop answering calls from the bank. She looked scared. Thank you, Rosa, I said. One last thing. Keep a copy of any letters or notices from the bank. You'll know when to use them. Yes, ma'am, she said softly. That night I drove past the estate. The long driveway glowed with strings of golden lights. Valets rushed between luxury cars. Music floated into the night, soft jazz champagne. Laughter, the sound of people pretending their world was unbreakable. From a distance, I could see Sarah standing near the entrance in a pale blue gown, her hair curled like it used to be when she was little. Ethan stood beside her, his hand possessively on her back. Veronica moved through the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects. I parked across the street and watched. A strange mix of sadness and satisfaction filled me. The house was magnificent under the lights, but I knew it was already mine. Every brick, every chandelier, every polished surface belonged to me, and they didn't know, not yet. At one point, Veronica raised her glass to make a toast. Her voice carried across the lawn. Tonight, she announced, we celebrate not just an engagement, but the joining of two families. Our legacy will continue through this union, to love tradition and heritage. The crowd clapped, cameras flashed, and in that instant I saw everything clearly, the illusion, the pride, the fragile empire built on borrowed money. It was a play, and I was the silent audience waiting for the curtain to fall. After midnight, when the music faded and the guests began to leave, I drove home. The house felt colder than usual. I sat in the living room with a glass of red wine, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table, the deed, the auction receipts, the bank's notice of foreclosure. Each page was a reminder that the power they worshipped had already changed hands. I imagined the moment they would find out. Would it be disbelief first, then anger, or quiet horror as realization set in? Either way, it would be poetic. But there was one thing left to do. Justice isn't complete until the guilty reveal themselves. I needed them to say in front of witnesses who they really were. The next morning, I called Jonathan. I want the title recorded publicly by Monday morning, and I want the notice delivered to the estate at exactly noon. Are you sure you want to do this personally? He asked. Yes, I said. They made it personal when they humiliated my daughter. After the call, I checked my reflection in the mirror. My husband used to tease me about the way I brushed my hair before every confrontation. You fight with elegance, he'd say. Maybe he was right. There's a certain power in looking calm when the world expects you to crumble. By Saturday afternoon, rumors had already begun swirling around town. Someone from the bank had leaked word that the Whitmore estate was in financial trouble. The Newport social circle was buzzing like a hornet's nest. People who once worshipped the Whitmores were suddenly whispering about cash flow issues and overextended credit. That evening, Sarah came to see me again, visibly shaken. Mom, did you hear people are saying Ethan's family is broke? It's all over the club. I looked at her gently, and what did Ethan say? He says it's lies, she said quickly. He says people are jealous, but I don't know. He's been on the phone all day with his father's lawyers. He snapped at me for asking questions. I took her hand. Sarah, sometimes the people who shout the loudest about reputation are the ones trying hardest to hide the truth. She looked at me confused, but searching. You sound like you know something. I smiled softly. Maybe I do. Maybe I just know what happens when arrogance forgets who's really watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window watching the moonlight spill across the floor. The air outside was still heavy, expectant like the final breath before thunder. Tomorrow the world would learn what the Whitmores truly were, and my daughter, my beautiful Sarah, would finally see them through my eyes. Tell me, have you ever stayed quiet just long enough to watch your enemy destroy themselves? Comment 1 if you believe silence can be the sharpest weapon. Like this, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your humility for weakness. Sunday morning arrived heavy with mist, the kind that makes the ocean disappear into the horizon. The world looked muted, as if nature itself were holding its breath. I woke early, unable to shake the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. The paperwork had gone through. The deed was mine, and by noon, the Whitmores would know it. I dressed carefully that morning. Not because I wanted to look impressive, but because I wanted to look like myself, the version of Linda McAllister they had chosen to underestimate. A simple gray coat, pearl earrings, my old leather purse, the same purse Veronica had once called quaint. I made coffee, watched the steam rise, and thought about the years I'd spent hiding my strength behind modesty. It had always been a choice, not a limitation. People like Veronica never understood that. At 11:45, my lawyer Jonathan called. The courier just left the county office, he said. The foreclosure and transfer notices are on their way to the estate. Delivery scheduled for noon sharp. Perfect timing, I said. Linda, you don't have to be there, he added gently. I do, I replied. I need to see their faces when the truth finally arrives. By the time I pulled up near the Whitmore mansion, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a clear blue sky. Their driveway was lined with cars. Again, Ethan's friends, Veronica's associates, people dressed in expensive clothes and self-importance. Another gathering another performance. I parked down the road and walked the rest of the way, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. As I approached, I could hear laughter spilling from the terrace, the kind of laughter that sounds more like competition than joy. I stepped through the open gates. No one stopped me. They probably assumed I was part of the catering staff. The irony wasn't lost on me. For people obsessed with status, they never actually looked at anyone below their imagined rank. Inside the courtyard, Veronica stood near a table draped in white linen, surrounded by guests sipping champagne. She was in her element, commanding, polished, cruelly radiant. When her eyes met mine, the color drained from her face for just a second before she recovered. Linda, she said, with that brittle smile, how unexpected. I was in the neighborhood, I said, glancing at the crowd. Thought I'd stop by and congratulate you all before the big day. Ethan joined her, his jaw tightening. This isn't really the right time, Mrs. McAllister. Isn't it? I asked calmly. You seem to have a lot to celebrate. Veronica's voice hardened. You weren't invited. No, I said. But then again, neither was reality. Her eyes narrowed, the meaning of my words clearly lost on her. Behind her, Sarah appeared startled to see me. Mom, she asked softly. I just came to wish you well, I said. Ethan slipped an arm around Sarah's waist too tightly. Your mother has a flair for drama, he said with a smirk, but we'll indulge her for a few minutes, won't we? Veronica forced a laugh, but I saw her hand tremble as she lifted her glass. Of course, though some people should really know their place. Place, I repeated. Interesting choice of word. Just then, a courier in a dark uniform appeared at the gate holding a brown envelope. He looked around uncertainly before spotting Veronica. Mrs. Veronica Whitmore, he called out. She frowned, yes. Delivery from Newport Heritage Bank, he said, handing her the envelope. Signature required. The crowd's chatter dimmed. Veronica's perfectly manicured hand hesitated before taking it. What is this? She asked half to herself. Official notice, ma'am, the courier said politely. Dated today. Ethan stepped closer, curiosity flashing in his eyes. Probably some routine paperwork, he said. But when Veronica opened the envelope and began reading, the blood drained from her face. The silence that followed was almost cinematic. She dropped the papers, her voice breaking. This can't be right. Ethan picked them up, scanning the first page. Foreclosure notice, he muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. What the hell is this? I watched quietly, my heartbeat steady. Keep reading, I suggested. He turned the page and froze. His eyes darted to me, then back to the paper. Buyer McAllister Holdings. His voice trembled. What does that mean? I met his gaze. It means, Ethan, that as of noon today, everything around you, this estate, this land, even the chair you're standing next to, belongs to me. The sound that came next was pure chaos. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of silk, and disbelief. Someone dropped their glass. It shattered on the marble floor. Sarah looked at me as if she couldn't breathe. Mom, what are you saying? I'm saying, I said quietly, that while they were mocking me for being poor, I was buying the house they were standing in. Veronica's voice cracked. You can't do this. This is our home. No, I said, stepping closer. It was your home. But you mortgaged it for your reputation. You turned pride into debt, and debt doesn't care about appearances. You scheming witch, she hissed, her mask of civility dissolving. You planned this. Yes, I said simply. I planned it the moment you told me I wasn't good enough for your son's family. The guests stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like an unscripted play. Ethan's face went from shock to fury. You humiliated us, he said through clenched teeth. No, I corrected him. You did that yourself. All I did was hold up a mirror. He took a step toward me, but Sarah grabbed his arm. Stop, she whispered, her voice shaking. Just stop. He turned on her. You knew about this. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, but maybe I should have. Veronica tried to compose herself, straightening her shoulders. This is absurd. We'll get it back. We'll sue you. Be my guest, I said, but make sure you can afford a lawyer first. At that, the crowd erupted into whispers. The same people who had clinked glasses with Veronica now looked at her with curiosity and disgust. The gossip was already spreading like wildfire, and I didn't have to say another word. Sarah looked at me helplessly. Mom, why? Because, sweetheart, I said softly, I needed you to see the truth. This family you were about to join would have crushed you. I couldn't stop you from loving him, but I could show you what love built on power really looks like when the power disappears. Ethan's face turned red. You think you're teaching us a lesson? You just exposed yourself as vindictive and pathetic. Perhaps, I said, but you'll be learning humility from the living proof. At that exact moment, Rosa the maid stepped forward from the edge of the terrace holding another envelope. Her hands trembled, but her voice was firm. Mrs. Whitmore, she said I was told to give you this. Veronica snatched it from her, tore it open, and read aloud in disbelief. Notification of immediate property access transfer owner Linda McAllister. All residents must vacate within 72 hours. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Veronica's knees seemed to weaken. Ethan caught her before she stumbled. Sarah stood still, her eyes darting between all of us like she didn't know where she belonged. Mom, she whispered to me, tell me this isn't revenge. I met her gaze. No, darling, it's balance. Veronica straightened her voice, shaking with rage. You'll regret this, Linda. You can't humiliate my family and get away with it. I'm not humiliating you, I said quietly. I'm liberating the truth you've buried under your diamonds. A few guests began to leave quietly, pretending to check their phones. Others stayed fascinated by the unraveling drama. The same people who once laughed at my thrift store purse were now watching their queen fall from her throne. Sarah took a step toward me, her voice trembling. You did this for me. For you, I said, and for every mother who's ever been told her child deserves a better life than the one she built. Ethan looked at Sarah with disbelief. You're not really siding with her, are you? Sarah turned to him slowly. You wanted me to believe my mother was beneath you. You called her a burden. You let your mother treat her like a servant. Maybe it's time I asked myself what kind of man thinks money makes him superior. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Sarah, please. She stepped back. Don't. You've already said enough. The silence that followed was thicker than fog. Veronica was shaking Ethan's face, pale, and Sarah, my sweet, stubborn daughter, finally saw what I had seen all along. I turned to leave, pausing at the gate. I'll have my lawyer contact you tomorrow, I said. You have 72 hours to vacate. I suggest you start packing. As I walked away, the murmurs behind me swelled into chaos. The mighty Whitmores, once untouchable, were now prisoners of their own arrogance. When I reached my car, I took one last look at the mansion. For a moment, I almost pitied them. But then I remembered the night Veronica told me you should be grateful. I smiled faintly. I am, I whispered, grateful that I don't need to live like that. I started the engine and drove off, leaving behind the echo of crumbling pride. Tell me something, if someone told you that you weren't good enough for their family, would you walk away quietly? Or would you make sure they learned the price of disrespect? Comment 1, if you'd have done exactly what I did. Like this, if you believe karma doesn't wait, it moves at the speed of justice. By the time I got home that evening, the sun was already melting into the horizon. My hands were still trembling, not from guilt, but from the weight of what had just happened. The silence in my house felt deeper than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. I sat down in the kitchen, the same place where this all began, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe, slowly, deliberately. I replayed every moment from the afternoon the courier's arrival, Veronica's trembling voice, Ethan's disbelief, Sarah's tears. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far. Maybe I'd crossed a line between justice and vengeance, but then I remembered the first night I met them, the way Veronica looked around my living room as if poverty were contagious, the way Ethan smirked at my old car, and the way Sarah had tried to apologize for them both. Some lessons can't be taught with kindness. Some people only understand loss. The phone rang, startling me. I picked it up and heard Sarah's voice on the other end, shaky but calm. Mom, can I come over? Of course, I said quietly. 30 minutes later, she walked into the kitchen, her mascara smudged her eyes red. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down across from me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. Finally, she whispered, "They're leaving the house." "I know," I said softly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "You planned all of this?" "Yes." Her lips trembled. "You could have told me." "If I had, you would have tried to stop me." She was silent for a moment, then shook her head. "Mom, I don't even know what to feel." Angry, shocked, relieved. "Feel all of it," I said. "You're entitled to every emotion." Tears welled in her eyes. "Ethan kept saying it was your fault, that you humiliated them on purpose." "Did I asked. She wiped her cheeks. "Maybe they deserved it. She stopped swallowing hard. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were rich?" I smiled faintly. "Because I never wanted you to think money defines worth. You grew up believing in effort, not inheritance. That's a gift money can't buy." She stared at me, her voice trembling. "But you could have spared me all this pain. You could have told me what you were capable of before I said yes to him." I looked down at my hands. Would it have mattered? You didn't fall in love with his money, Sarah. You fell in love with the idea of being accepted. I needed you to see that their acceptance had a price you were never meant to pay. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. He tried to call me after you left. He begged me to stay, said the money doesn't matter. But when I asked if he would still love me if I were poor, he couldn't answer. That's your answer, I said. Sarah nodded her shoulders, sagging as if she'd been holding the world up alone. You know, when I was a little girl, I used to think you were the strongest person in the world. I smiled sadly, and now I know you're also the smartest, she said quietly. For the first time that night, I felt something crack inside me, not guilt, but tenderness. I reached across the table and took her hand. I didn't do this to destroy them, Sarah. I did it to remind you that you come from strength, not shame. She squeezed my hand. I know, I just wish you hadn't had to prove it this way. We sat there until midnight, talking about everything, the lies, the debt, the years of silence. By the time she left, her eyes looked clearer, her voice steadier. I stood by the window watching her car disappear into the distance and whispered a quiet prayer that she'd never mistake arrogance for confidence again. When the house was silent again, I poured myself another glass of wine and walked into my study. On the desk sat the folder with the title Deed Proof of Power, or maybe Proof of Pain. I opened it one last time and stared at my own signature. Beneath the legal language and stamped seals, I saw something else, a reflection of the person I'd become. Not just a mother or a widow or a banker, a woman who had learned that sometimes justice wears a quiet smile. My phone buzzed. A text from Jonathan. The Whitmore's foreclosure has made the local papers. Reporters are calling it the fall of Newport's first family. Do you want to make a statement? I typed back, no statement. Silence says enough. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, but send a donation to the Newport Women's Shelter, under their name, not mine. A few minutes later, Jonathan replied, consider it done. You're making quite the legacy, Linda. Legacy. The word lingered. I never cared for legacies built on wealth. I wanted one built on example. Maybe this was the start of it. The next day, as news of the Whitmore's downfall spread, I avoided the phone and the television. I spent the morning baking just like I used to before my husband passed flour on my hands, music humming low in the background. Around noon, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, I found a familiar figure standing on the porch. Veronica Whitmore. She looked smaller somehow, her perfect hair undone, her makeup smudged. The sharpness in her eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow. Linda, she said softly, can I come in? I hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. She entered like a woman entering a confessional. I gestured toward the kitchen table. Coffee. She nodded wordlessly. When I placed the cup in front of her, her hands trembled slightly. She took a sip, then set it down. You win, she said. This wasn't a game, I replied. To you, maybe not, she said bitterly, but to me, everything was a game. Social circles, appearances, money. I thought if I just looked powerful enough, no one would notice how scared I was. Scared of what? Losing everything, she whispered, and now I have. For a moment, I felt an unexpected ache of pity. She wasn't the villain anymore, just a woman stripped of her armor. You didn't have to lose it, Veronica, I said. You just had to stop pretending. She laughed softly, a broken sound. You're right. I spent years building a castle made of smoke. You walked in and showed me how fragile it was. We sat there in silence. Then she said Sarah came to see me this morning. She told me she's ending the engagement. I know, I said quietly. She's stronger than I gave her credit for, Veronica admitted. You raised her well. I looked at her surprised. That almost sounds like a compliment. It is, she said simply. I used to think wealth was inheritance, but now I see it's the way you raise your children to stand tall when the world tries to bend them. We sat together for a while longer, two women from opposite worlds now sitting in the same quiet truth. When she finally stood to leave, she looked at me one last time. You could have destroyed us completely, she said. Why didn't you? I smiled faintly. Because dignity isn't about destruction, Veronica. It's about knowing when you've already won. After she left, I went outside and stood on the porch. The sky was bright, the sea calm again. Somewhere out there, the Whitmores were packing their things, their empire reduced to boxes. I didn't feel joy or regret, just peace. Inside the house, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Jonathan. The press wants to know who bought the estate. Do I tell them? I typed my reply carefully. Not yet, let them wonder. Sometimes mystery is more powerful than truth. When I set the phone down, I realized the tremor in my hands was gone. The storm had passed. Tell me something when someone wrongs you. Do you strike back in anger, or do you wait until the truth itself becomes your weapon? Comment 1. If you believe patience is the most dangerous form of revenge. Like this, if you've ever learned that silence can roar louder than fury. The call came late on Tuesday evening, just as the sky turned the color of wet slate. I had been reading quietly in the living room when my phone vibrated across the coffee table. Sarah's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering, sensing in my chest that something inside her had cracked open. Mom, she said, her voice low but steady. I'm at the Whitmore estate. He asked to see me. I set my book aside. Do you want me to come? No, she said after a pause. I need to do this alone. Her words settled into me like a slow, deliberate exhale. I wanted to protect her, but this confrontation wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. I had already played my part in tearing down their facade. Now she had to face the truth on her own. I'm proud of you, I said, but promise me something, don't argue. Just listen, and when you're done, walk away. I will, she said quietly. I just need to hear him admit it. After she hung up, I sat in the stillness of my house. The air smelled faintly of lavender and rain. I imagined Sarah standing in that grand living room surrounded by all the opulence that had once dazzled her. It must have felt different now, hollow, temporary, like a stage waiting for its final act. Later that night, when she told me what had happened, her voice carried the calm of someone who had finally seen through an illusion. She had arrived at the estate around 8 o'clock. The once proud mansion was dimly lit, half-packed boxes stacked near the staircase. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now absorbed silence like a wound. Ethan was waiting for her in the foyer, his tie loose, his posture slumped. Sarah, he said when she walked in. His tone was subdued, his arrogance drained out. Thank you for coming. She stood near the doorway, her arms crossed. You said you wanted to talk. I owe you an apology, he said, running a hand through his hair. I know how this looks. Everything with your mother, it got out of control. Out of control, she repeated, her voice sharp. You and your mother humiliated her. You treated me like a charity case. And now that you've lost everything, you want to apologize. Ethan winced. You don't understand. My parents were under pressure. The debts, the investors. Don't blame your parents, she interrupted. You stood beside them every time they belittled me. You didn't flinch when your mother told me I'd never fit in. You agreed when she said my family didn't belong in your world. He took a step closer. I was wrong. All right, I was stupid. I thought money meant stability. I thought you wanted that too. Sarah's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. I wanted love, respect, a partner who didn't need to look down on others to feel tall. He reached out as if to touch her arm, but she stepped back. Please, Sarah, he said softly. We can start over. The house doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. She looked around the grand foyer, the marble floors, the chandeliers, the empty frames where paintings had been taken down. You're right, she said finally. None of it matters anymore. He smiled faintly hopeful. Then we can fix this. She met his eyes. No, Ethan. I mean, none of it matters, including us. His smile faltered. You don't mean that. I do, she said. Because if you really believed what you just said, if you believed money doesn't matter, you wouldn't be begging for forgiveness in a house you already lost. His shoulders stiffened. You think you're better than me now because your mother played some corporate trick. It wasn't a trick, she said. It was truth, and you still can't handle it. He laughed bitterly. Your mother's ruined everything. She turned us into a spectacle. No, Ethan, she said, her voice rising for the first time. You did that the day you decided to measure people's worth by what they owned. My mother didn't ruin you. She revealed you. For a moment he had no reply. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to her. So that's it. You're just walking away. Yes, she said. For once I'm walking towards something, my dignity. He took a step forward, desperation creeping back into his tone. Sarah, please, I love you. She shook her head. You love what I represented, the illusion that you were marrying into virtue. But virtue isn't inherited, Ethan. It's earned. When she turned to leave, he called after her, "You'll regret this." She stopped, hand on the doorknob, and looked over her shoulder. "No," she said softly, "you will." When she told me that part, her voice didn't shake. It carried a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be believed. After she left the estate, she drove straight to my house. I was waiting by the window when her car pulled into the driveway. She came inside, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked exhausted but lighter somehow. "It's over," she said simply. I nodded. "It was over the moment you saw who he really was." She sat down, folding her hands on the table. He looked lost, like a boy who'd been taught the wrong lessons his whole life. "Maybe he was," I said softly, "but that's not your burden to fix." For a while, we sat in silence. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window. Then Sarah said something I'll never forget. "You know, Mom, I used to think you were hard, too serious, too calculated. But now I understand. You weren't hard, you were prepared." I smiled faintly. Prepared is just another word for having been through hell and taking notes. She laughed quietly, a sound that felt like closure. That night, as I tucked the deed into a locked drawer, I felt the last of my anger dissolve. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't rage that filled me. It was relief. Not because they had fallen, but because my daughter had finally risen. Sometimes victory isn't loud or cruel. It's quiet. It's the sound of a door closing and a woman choosing to walk away from everything that once made her doubt her worth. Tell me something, have you ever looked at someone you once loved and realized they were just a lesson in disguise? Comment 1, if you have, like this, if you believe that dignity once awakened never sleeps again. By Thursday morning, silence was no longer an option. The storm had found me. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop, vibrating across the kitchen counter like it had something urgent to confess. I poured coffee, turned on the television, and there it was. My name spelled in bold letters at the bottom of the screen. The mystery buyer of the Whitmore estate revealed local widow, Linda McAllister. The news anchor's voice was calm but laced with astonishment. Sources confirmed that the longtime Newport resident, previously believed to live on a modest pension, purchased the Whitmore mansion at auction for $6 million. When reached for comment, Mrs. McAllister declined to make a public statement. I stood there for a long moment, holding my mug, watching my quiet world unravel on national television. The phone rang again. This time it was Jonathan. "Linda, you're officially famous," he said, half amused, half concerned. "I suppose there are worse scandals to be caught in," I said dryly. "They're calling it poetic justice," he continued. "Every paper in the States picked it up. The Whitmore's collapse is front-page news. Reporters want interviews. The Boston Herald is running a feature on you tomorrow." I sighed. "I didn't do this for fame, Jonathan." "I know," he said softly, "but you can't control a story once it leaves your hands." He was right. By noon, 2 news vans had parked at the end of my street. Reporters hovered outside my gate, microphones in hand, calling my name like it was suddenly synonymous with revenge and righteousness. "Mrs. McAllister, did you plan this purchase as retaliation? How long have you known the Whitmore family? Is it true your daughter broke off her engagement after the deal?" I didn't answer any of them. I simply closed my gate, drew the curtains, and let the noise echo outside. But the world doesn't stop spinning just because you refuse to dance. By evening, my quiet home had become a battlefield of headlines. The widow who bought back her pride. The fall of the Newport aristocracy, a modern morality tale. When Sarah came home, she looked shaken. "Mom, they're everywhere," she said, setting her phone on the counter. "They're calling you the Silent Storm." I almost laughed. "That's dramatic." She smiled weakly. "It fits." A knock at the door interrupted us. Sarah opened it and froze. Standing there, drenched from the light rain, was Veronica. She looked nothing like the woman who had once ruled Newport's social scene. Her expensive clothes hung loose, her face pale, her mascara smudged beneath her eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something fragile, something almost human. "Linda," she said softly, "please." I gestured for her to come in. "You'll catch a cold." She stepped inside hesitantly, her heels clicking against the floor. Sarah hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Veronica turned to me. "They're tearing us apart," she whispered. "The media, the neighbors. Everyone's talking about the auction, the party, the humiliation. My friends won't return my calls. My husband's gone to stay with his brother in Chicago." Her voice trembled. "I have nothing left." I studied her for a moment, the same woman who once told me I didn't belong in her world. Now she was standing in my modest kitchen asking for understanding she had never offered anyone else. "I didn't want this," I said quietly. "I wanted accountability, not destruction." "But destruction is what you got," she said bitterly. "Do you know what it's like to have your name dragged through the mud?" I set down my mug. "Do you know what it's like to be treated like you're invisible?" She flinched, then her eyes softened. "Maybe I do now." For a long moment, the three of us stood there in silence. The mother who had been mocked, the daughter who had almost been lost, and the woman who had finally been stripped of her illusions. Sarah spoke first. "Mom didn't ruin you," she said quietly. "You ruined yourselves the moment you thought respect could be bought." Veronica turned toward her, eyes glistening. "You sound just like her." "I hope so," Sarah replied. Veronica looked back at me. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," I said. "You can rebuild, or you can keep pretending the world owes you something. But either way, your story won't be written by arrogance anymore." She nodded slowly, the fight finally gone from her posture. "You're a remarkable woman, Linda. I wish I'd seen that sooner." "You weren't looking," I said. She gave a faint, sad smile. "Maybe not. But thank you for teaching me, even if it was the hardest way possible." After she left, Sarah and I watched from the window as Veronica walked down the quiet street, shoulders hunched against the drizzle. It struck me that this, too, was a kind of justice, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that humbles. 2 days later, the city council called. They wanted to honor me at a community event to recognize my act of moral courage. I declined. Heroism wasn't what this was. It was simply consequence. Instead, I made a quiet decision. I called Jonathan and told him to prepare the paperwork to donate the Whitmore estate to the Newport Women's Foundation. "Use it as a shelter or a training center," I said. "Something that gives women a start without having to beg for validation." He hesitated. "Are you sure, Linda? That property's worth millions." "I'm sure," I said. "The mansion never belonged to me. I just held it long enough to prove that character matters more than inheritance." When the announcement went public, the news cycle shifted again. The widow who gave away the mansion she bought in silence. Reporters called it an act of grace. I called it closure. On Sunday morning, Sarah and I drove past the estate one last time. The iron gate stood open now, the lawn empty, the curtains drawn. The sign out front read, "Future site of the McAllister Women's Resource Center." Sarah looked out the window, tears gathering in her eyes. "You really gave it away," she said softly. "I never wanted it," I replied. "I just wanted the truth." She smiled faintly. "You got it, Mom, all of it." As we drove away, I thought about Veronica somewhere out there trying to rebuild. About Ethan probably grappling with the kind of loss that forces you to see who you are without privilege. And about Sarah strong, centered, finally free. By the time we reached home, the last of the reporters had disappeared. The world had moved on to its next story. But inside me there was a quiet, steady peace that no headline could ever capture. Justice doesn't always arrive with handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a deed signed in silence and a home given to strangers who need it more. Tell me, if you had the chance to own everything that once made you feel small, would you keep it or give it away to prove you never needed it? Comment 1. If you'd choose dignity, like this, if you believe real power isn't in taking, it's in letting go. The first letter arrived 3 days after I donated the mansion. It was handwritten on floral stationery addressed simply to Mrs. Linda McAllister, the woman who reminded us what matters. Inside, the words were shaky but sincere. I watched your story on the news. My husband left me last year after 30 years of marriage. I thought my life was over, but seeing you stand tall without anger gave me strength. You made me believe that losing everything can sometimes mean finding yourself again. It was signed Margaret, 63. I sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light stretching across the floor, and read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't realize then that it would be the first of hundreds. Within a week, envelopes began arriving from every corner of the country. Women and men, young and old strangers, who saw in my silence something they'd been waiting to feel for years: vindication without violence. A journalist from the Providence Journal called the movement the McAllister effect. I thought it was ridiculous at first, the idea of turning one act of personal justice into a slogan. But then a letter from a small-town teacher in Kansas changed my mind. Your story made me finally report my corrupt principal. I thought I'd lose everything, but I realized silence helps the wrong people win. Silence. The very weapon I had used to undo arrogance had now become a lesson that others were using to reclaim their voices. By the end of the month, local TV stations began covering the opening of the McAllister Women's Resource Center, the former Whitmore mansion reborn under a new name and a new purpose. The same marble floors where Veronica had once hosted her exclusive dinners now echoed with the footsteps of volunteers and the laughter of children. The chandeliers still glowed, but now they illuminated women learning to code study and start over. I didn't attend the opening ceremony. I watched it from home on the same television that had once broadcast my so-called scandal. The mayor gave a speech about resilience. The local bishop called the center a cathedral of redemption. And then, to my surprise, the camera cut to a familiar face. Veronica Whitmore stood at the podium. The room went silent as she began to speak. Some months ago, she said, her voice steady but soft, this house represented everything wrong with who I'd become. It was a symbol of vanity, of inherited pride, of believing that appearances matter more than kindness. Today, it represents something else. Forgiveness. The crowd murmured. Veronica continued, Mrs. McAllister taught me a lesson I didn't want to learn. I spent years looking down on others, never realizing that true worth looks you in the eye and never needs to announce itself. I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to the grace she showed when she could have crushed me. She paused, her gaze rising to the camera as if she knew I was watching. Thank you, Linda, she said, for showing me that losing everything can sometimes be the only way to gain perspective. I didn't realize I was crying until Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder. You did it, Mom, she whispered. No, I said, softly wiping my eyes. We did. That evening, I stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and salt. Down the block, two neighbors I barely knew waved as I passed. We're proud of you, Mrs. McAllister, one called. I nodded, still not used to being a symbol. The next morning, a letter arrived from the bank's chairman, Peter Lang, the same man who had once whispered confidential numbers into my ear. Linda. I thought I'd seen every kind of power play in finance. But yours wasn't a play. It was a principle. You reminded me that money can't buy class, but dignity can bankrupt arrogance. It was strange seeing these words from men who had once dismissed women like me as sentimental. It felt as if the quiet rebellion of one old widow had rippled through an entire generation of watchers and skeptics. A week later, I received a call from a college student named Elise, one of the first residents at the new resource center. Mrs. McAllister, she said, her voice bright with nervous energy. I'm studying finance because of you. I saw what you did and realized women belong in rooms where decisions are made, not just where they're affected. I smiled. Then make sure when you get there, you leave the door open for the next one. As the days passed, the story began to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But something quieter lingered. People who passed me in the grocery store smiled differently now, not with pity, but with respect. My anonymity was gone, but in its place stood something stronger. One evening, Sarah and I went for a walk by the harbor. The sunset spread across the water like melted gold. Do you ever miss the quiet? She asked. I thought about it. Sometimes. But silence has a way of finding you again once the noise burns out. She laughed softly. I think Dad would have been proud. I smiled. He always said justice doesn't need applause, just timing. When we got home, I checked the mail again. Another envelope, this one from a return address in Chicago. Inside was a single sheet of paper with neat handwriting. You were right. We had to lose everything to see ourselves clearly. Thank you for reminding us that character once lost can still be rebuilt. It was signed Veronica. I folded the letter, slipped it into the same drawer as Margaret's, and closed it gently. The next morning, the papers ran one last headline before the story faded completely from mansion to movement, how one widow redefined power. I didn't buy a copy. I didn't need to. The proof was already in motion, the women studying inside the house, that arrogance built the men learning that humility could be stronger than heritage, and my daughter finally living a life free of apology. I had never wanted fame. I only wanted to show that sometimes the smallest acts, a quiet purchase, a signed deed, a refusal to bow, can ignite something far greater than revenge. Tell me, have you ever done something small that rippled far beyond what you imagined? Comment 1. If you believe every act of quiet courage matters. Like this, if you think dignity spreads like fire once it's seen. 2 months later, the headlines had gone quiet. The world had moved on as it always does. News stories fade, cameras turn away, and public outrage dissolves into the next scandal waiting to be devoured. But for me, the silence that returned wasn't empty. It was earned. It felt like peace. The Whitmore Mansion. The McAllister Women's Center was alive every day now. The once exclusive gates stood open to anyone seeking help, the marble foyer echoing with footsteps of hope instead of arrogance. I visited sometimes discreetly, slipping in through the back entrance so no one would make a fuss. I'd watch the women studying in what used to be Veronica's grand dining room. Laptops glowed on the same table where champagne glasses once clinked. The chandeliers shimmered above, not for wealth anymore, but for light. One afternoon, a young woman stopped me in the hallway. "Mrs. McAllister," she asked shyly, "thank you for this place. I didn't know where to go when I left my husband. Now I'm learning accounting here. Next month, I start a job at the bank downtown." I smiled. "You did that, not me." She shook her head. "No, ma'am. You showed us what starting over looks like." After she left, I lingered for a moment by the staircase, running my fingers over the polished banister. I thought of Veronica descending those same steps in silk gowns, of Ethan laughing with his friends by the fireplace. How strange that the very walls that once whispered of privilege now carried echoes of resilience. Outside, the garden had changed too. Gone were the manicured hedges trimmed into perfect symmetry. In their place grew wildflowers, colorful, defiant, imperfectly beautiful. A volunteer told me the new residents planted them together, calling it the Garden of Second Chances. That night, I sat by my window with a cup of tea, watching the tide pull against the rocks. My phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan appeared: final settlement complete. The Whitmores paid off the remaining balance and surrendered the deed. The case is officially closed. I read the message twice, then deleted it. Some things didn't need to live on in my memory anymore. A week later, I received a letter from Veronica, not handwritten this time, but typed formal, almost businesslike. "Linda, we've moved into a small house near Narragansett. Ethan is working at a local firm. I volunteer at the Women's Center every Wednesday. You were right, humility is painful, but it's also cleansing. Thank you for giving me the chance to rebuild." There was no anger in her words, no bitterness, just the kind of honesty that only comes after everything else has been stripped away. I folded the letter and placed it with the others. There was something poetic about her volunteering in the house she once owned. Life has a way of closing its circles with perfect symmetry. Sarah was thriving too. She had taken a position at a legal aid foundation working with low-income families. "I think this is what I was meant to do," she told me one evening over dinner. "Help people find their voice before they lose their dignity." I smiled. "Sounds like someone I know." She laughed. "I learned from the best." Sometimes when we talked about Ethan, there was no anger in her voice anymore, just a quiet kind of understanding. He called once, she admitted, wanted to apologize. I told him I hoped he'd learn from all this. "I think he's trying." "Good," I said. "Forgiveness isn't weakness, Sarah. It's just knowing when the lesson's already been learned." That night after she left, I opened the window and let the ocean breeze fill the room. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Not to the world, not to my past, not even to myself. Justice had come and gone. What remained was balance. The following Sunday, I attended the Women's Center's first scholarship ceremony. I sat quietly in the back as a dozen young women received grants under the McAllister Foundation. Each of them took the stage trembling and tearful, speaking about second chances, about strength, about believing they were enough. At the end, the host, one of the volunteers, called me to the stage. "We wouldn't be here without her," she said. "A woman who turned betrayal into purpose." The applause was gentle, genuine. I walked up slowly, my heart pounding, not from nerves, but from gratitude. When the microphone was handed to me, I didn't have a speech prepared. I just looked out at all those faces, hopeful, fierce, alive, and spoke from the only place that ever mattered truth. "I never wanted revenge," I said quietly. "I wanted respect. Not just for me, but for every woman who's ever been told she isn't enough because she doesn't wear wealth on her sleeve. We can't control how people see us, but we can control how we stand. And when you stand with dignity, the world eventually notices." There was silence for a moment, then soft applause that grew into something that felt like wind. Warm, unstoppable, collective. After the ceremony, a reporter approached me. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, "if you could go back and change anything, would you?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," I said finally, because if I hadn't been underestimated, I might never have discovered how powerful quiet strength can be. He smiled and scribbled down my words, but I didn't need them printed anywhere. The story had already written itself in the lives of those women inside the mansion. That evening, I returned home, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window as the waves rolled in. Somewhere I knew Veronica was doing the same in her small house by the sea. Maybe she was thinking about the life she'd lost, or maybe, like me, she was thinking about the peace she'd finally found. Some endings aren't victories or defeats. They're simply full stops at the end of a long sentence that no longer needs to be rewritten. Tell me something if you were given the chance to choose between revenge that burns and justice that heals. Which would you choose? Comment 1 if you'd choose healing. Like this if you believe that peace is the finest form of victory. Spring arrived early that year. The air along the coast carried that soft, salt-sweet scent that comes only after the cold has finally given up. My garden was alive again, roses, lilies, even the stubborn lavender that had refused to bloom last year. I spent the morning pruning branches dirt under my nails, the sun warm on my back. It was the kind of quiet work that reminds you who you are when the world stops watching. When I finished, I walked down to the old footpath that curved toward the harbor. The sea shimmered like glass waves, rolling slow and patient. The McAllister Women's Center stood tall across the bay, sunlight glinting off its windows. I could hear laughter faintly in the distance, children playing on the lawn, women chatting under the porch. It no longer looked like a monument to arrogance. It looked like life. I thought about everything that had happened, the insults, the silence, the confrontation, the redemption. Somewhere along the way, my pain had transformed into purpose. I hadn't planned it that way, but maybe that's what grace really is, turning wounds into something that grows. Sometimes I still think of my husband. He would have loved this part, the end of the noise, the calm after the storm. He used to tell me dignity doesn't need to shout Linda. It just needs to stand still long enough for truth to find it. I never understood what he meant until now. The truth had found me not because I chased revenge, but because I stood still long enough to see that revenge was never the point. That evening, Sarah came over with dinner. We sat on the porch, eating and watching the last of the sun melt into the horizon. "You know, Mom," she said, "sometimes I think your story isn't about revenge at all." I smiled. It never was. "It's about legacy," she continued, "about showing the world that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and people still hear it." I nodded. "That's the only kind worth having." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Do you ever miss the quiet life before all this?" I looked out at the fading light, the sky blushing orange and pink. "No," I said softly, "because this is still quiet. It's just quieter inside me now." She smiled, and for a moment everything felt perfectly aligned, the sea, the wind, the rhythm of breathing. I realized then that peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the absence of needing to explain yourself. Later, after she left, I walked back into the garden. The night had settled gently, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. I knelt beside the wildflowers, the ones that had taken over the old stone path, and traced my fingers along the petals. They had grown from nothing, just like me. No one had planned them, but here they were thriving. In that moment, I understood something I wish I'd known all along. Life doesn't give you closure. You build it yourself, one act of courage at a time. As I stood up, a light breeze swept through the yard, carrying the faint sound of laughter from across the bay. The mansion was alive again, and in its walls, women were writing their own stories of reclamation. That was the real ending. Not mine, but theirs. I turned toward the house, feeling the weight of the years settle lightly on my shoulders. I wasn't the same woman who had sat in silence while others mocked her for her clothes, her car, her neighborhood. That woman had been wounded but waiting. The one who stood here now was whole, and she no longer needed anyone to recognize her worth. Before heading inside, I looked up at the stars beginning to appear and whispered, "We did it." I wasn't talking to the world. I was talking to the quiet strength that had carried me through every moment of doubt, the same strength that lives in anyone who refuses to bow to cruelty. Because in the end, dignity doesn't win with noise. It wins by enduring. It wins by surviving long enough to turn judgment into silence, and silence into meaning. Tell me something, have you ever realized that the moment you stop fighting to be understood is the moment you finally are? Comment 1. If you've ever found peace after chaos. Like this, if you believe the truest revenge is to live with grace. And if my story reaches you at a time when you feel small, remember this, the world will always try to measure you by what you own. But the only real wealth is knowing who you are when everything else is taken away. Because respect can't be bought, dignity can't be borrowed, and justice, real justice, doesn't need witnesses. It just needs truth.